Hello and welcome to episode 3 of When Have We Stood Silent? When Have We Walked for Justice? A look at the history of the Church of the Brethren, as well as the times when we were complicit to systems of injustice, and those times which we spoke out and acted out against those same systems. I am Pastor Andrew, and I want to thank you for taking the time to tune in. We will be having a further conversation through Zoom privately this Sunday morning at 9:30. The information for that call will be sent out on an email on Saturday. If you have not been receiving those emails and would like to participate in that conversation, please contact us at the church office so that we can include you on those emails. And with no further ado, let us look at our history beginning in the late 1700s. As I mentioned in episode 2, the Brethren had begun to migrate away from Germantown, Pennsylvania as early as the 1740s. And as time went on, more people left and migrated both south and eventually west. And moving south, they encountered enslaved persons and the institution of slavery up close and personal for the first time. They knew about slavery, first of all, because they were in North America, and they also knew about Germans in Europe who had participated or were participating in slavery because as early as 1760s, as we have learned from the writings of Christopher Sauer II. Slavery was not something that was hidden, and the Brethren knew about this, what was happening. One example of this comes from Thomas Jefferson, who spoke of the German immigrants, and that would be the Brethren as well as the Mennonites, who had such wonderful farming practices. Jefferson writes this, that he was amazed at what they could do with so little land, as they did not have enslaved persons working upon the property. They knew then what was happening. If they were within proximity of Jefferson at Monticello, which they certainly were, they knew what was happening in the world around them. We can see this in the official word that was presented or has been preserved and presented to us through the yearly meeting. That was the once a year gathering by as many members from the church as could gather to decide how they would live out their faith, how they would practice their faith, as well as answer questions that arose both of the social nature as well as those that pertain to the Bible. In the year 1797, the yearly meeting affirmed and officially stated that slaveholders could not join the church. This decision was reaffirmed in 1812 and again in 1813. And those who did not comply or did not wish to comply would be disfellowshipped, and those who would not free the slaves that they owned would not be allowed to join the church. There was the caveat, however, that they could rejoin the church or join for the first time if they publicly confessed their sins to the body, that would be to the church, of what it is that they were doing that was out of compliance with these statements. In 1835, it was affirmed that, and I quote, "considered to make no difference on account of color, and answering the question on how," again, quote, "to receive colored persons into the church." So it was that we began this discussion early in our time here in North America. However, the question of whether or not one could be a slave owner and a member of the church came repeatedly to the yearly meeting until the end of the Civil War. So we're talking about a significant amount of time in which this was discussed, again, by the representation of the body of annual meeting or yearly meeting. There was also the question about what to do in regard to the holy kiss between white and I use this term because that is how it was written in quotes, colored members in 1845 and again in 1849. Yearly meetings answer is less than acceptable, in my opinion, because they stated first, quote, there is a repugnance in some of our white members to salute colored person in this manner. And secondly, and again, quote, colored members, end quote, were asked to, quote, bear with that weakness and not offer the kiss to such weak members until they become stronger and make the first offer. The holy kiss was the standard greeting for the brethren at that time, in which members of the same gender would greet one another not only with a handshake, but also a kiss upon the lips, a practice that is not done with much frequency today, but was very common at that time. And so there is questions about what it is that they should do. As we know from American history classes that we have taken previously, the United States had become increasingly divided over slavery leading up to the Civil War. Continuing its position of non-resistance and adopting an anti-secessionist stance put the Church of the Brethren into an unpopular position, especially in the South, where many of its membership lived. But I wonder how many of those members ended up fighting in the Civil War after all. As Dernbaugh states in The Fruit of the Vine, the fines for not joining the army was $200 to $500 per person in the South. As I was looking at this information and for more answers, I found that in 1866, that would be the year after the Civil War, the average farmer earned $26 to $70 per month as a laborer on a farm, and we're not counting the enslaved persons within that total. So it is that they would have been asked to pay a significant amount of money to not fight on either side, both either the South or the North. A sum of money that would have been nearly unattainable, I would think, for most individuals, unless there was some help from the local congregations, which there certainly was. In fact, there were often collections for those who did not wish to fight. And there's even the story again in Dernbaugh's book of $9,000 being raised so that the men within particular or in certain congregations would not have to be involved in combat. If we look at that fee or divide that fee out by $200, we will see that that would be 45 men. If we divide it out by $500, that's only 18. And yet the population we know of the church at that time was in the thousands. And so 18 to 45 men would only represent a small fraction of the number of people who were in the church. In my opinion, the Church of the Brethren was also divided with its membership as it was spread among free and slave states in all parts of the country, but especially between North and South, with much of the membership living in Pennsylvania or Virginia. Given the frequency of which the question of slavery is brought to yearly meeting over 60 plus years, it shows that there was division within the church. If we read into that, there were people who were raising the question for a variety of reasons, in fact, and yet the question was still being raised. And so I think there was a dilemma here facing the members of the congregation, if not the denomination itself. It is difficult but necessary to say that we, as the Church of the Brethren, did not uniformly condemn slavery. Again, we may have as a denomination, but how this was lived out within its membership had mixed results. There were those who did condemn slavery vocally and publicly, and some of them paid the ultimate price for doing so. The most commonly cited example is that of Elder John Klein, who was an itinerant preacher, husband, farmer, and doctor, among other occupations. By his own estimations, he traveled 30,000 miles, most of which were on his horse Nell. The elder Klein, on one of these trips back to his home in Virginia, was shot dead. The crime has never been solved. Those which perpetrated it have never been found, either then or throughout the history now. The elder Klein would go freely from both sides, both crossing the northern line as well as the southern line, and one time was ambushed and then again shot dead. There were others throughout the country who experienced a loss of property, who were imprisoned or heavily fined for their beliefs. The numbers of those and the names of all those who suffered in these ways have been lost to history, unfortunately. The Civil War presented a difficult time not only to our country, but also to our church. The westward expansion beyond the Appalachians started around the year 1800 as the Brethren made their way into Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana by the year 1820. The doctrine of manifest destiny may have driven some west in search of farmable land, as the vast majority of the church's membership were still farmers. Another reason was that after the upheaval of and their mistreatment during the American Revolution, many wished to find a quiet place to live and worship. And moving west and south for that matter, the Brethren took over lands that were or had been inhabited by various indigenous people. There were the Miamake, or the Miami, the Kikianga, those that lived around Fort Wayne, the Ionewa, the Cherokee, and the Yucats, those that lived here around Modesto. And incidentally, the first group of Brethren came to California in the year 1856, although I'm not sure exactly where it was that they ended up. So the question that is necessary to ask is if they had any recognition of what they were doing, or did the Brethren simply come to recolonize? The earliest settlers into Ohio came in the areas where the Native American populations had recently been forcibly removed. They knew what had happened and they intentionally went into those areas. And Fruit of the Vine, it reads that these early brethren had been recruited by the railroads because of their work ethic and often provided free tickets to ministers who may have wanted to survey a certain area. The assumption by the railroads was that if a minister returned with a favorable report, that a large influx of colonizers would come into that area. And so they were doing this not out of the goodness of their hearts to provide a free ticket on the railroads, but that they realized that the people probably would buy tickets to move. And they also knew that the Brethren were agrarian people and they had expertise in farming. And so that they would raise crops, they would plant farms, and that they would sell their goods, and they would need a means of transportation to do so. And so it was that they would turn to the railroads to transport these goods from one place to another, at least if they were over long distances. And the railroad companies would charge a fee to do so. Thus, the companies were doing this to turn a profit, which is not surprising. I want to take just a moment to look at a couple slides that I made for today. Give me just a moment. The first of these slides is in regards to slavery. This is a map of American slavery in 1850 with one dot representing 2,500 people. It is difficult to view. Our second slide is from the US Census. And this shows the enslaved persons within the southern United States in the year 1860. Our third slide shows a map of Virginia, again of that same year, 1860, which is a bit more, a closer detail. I show this because it highlights the counties in which the Church of the Brethren found themselves, which are in this region here. Or at least this experienced the largest concentration of brethren. This last picture shows a current screenshot of the Church of the Brethrens and their vicinity to Monticello, which was the home of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, as we know, owned many enslaved persons. This blue arrow here shows Monticello's location. The red crosses show current Church of the Brethrens. This is not a historical document, but it shows that the brethren were within proximity to Jefferson, and thus they did know what was happening. This slide shows Native American lands. What happened to them over time. Let that cycle through one more time. This shows a map not only of the United States, but also of Canada. And it shows the different indigenous populations, the nations, their names, in which they were located. If we look carefully, we will see the Lenape people who were located around where Germantown was. This is a visual map of the United States, mostly of the United States, the various peoples and nations where they're located with our current boundaries, but using historical data. a list on this last slide where I was able to obtain this information, and I would encourage you to view it as you can. It is powerful, and I think lends itself to the conversation that we are having. Because we need to look at the question of, did our spiritual ancestors know what was happening? Looking at those maps of enslaved persons and indigenous populations, I think it is impossible to say that they didn't know. I think that they definitely knew what was happening, and how did they participate, directly or indirectly, is the question. And it is an uncomfortable truth to see that we did participate, again, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly. There are some glimmers of hope with individuals such as the elder John Klein, who spoke out publicly in opposition of slavery. There are other individuals as well, many of which have been lost to history. We also need to look at who the Church of the Brethren was at that time, in addition to whether they knew or whether they didn't, and what they said or didn't say. Because despite the railroad's courting of the Dunkards, they were still largely viewed as outsiders by many because of their beliefs and practices, as well as by their language and by the manner of their dress. The membership at this time was largely bilingual in both English and in German, having been in North America for around 100 years at this point. Yet they still worshiped, conducted church business, and much of the church publications were still printed in German. And this isolated them to a degree from the communities that were around them. The church was insular or sectarian in nature, and much of this was because of self-preservation for the reasons that were mentioned previously. The church was beginning to crystallize its beliefs and its practices, but for the first time, they cited their own history as the reasoning behind a decision rather than strictly from an interpretation that they had derived from the Bible. This was found in 1861 in discussing how the membership should dress, and I quote, "The order and dress as generally practiced by the old brethren and sisters shall be the manner in which the membership of the church so dresses." This, coupled with a strict adherence towards discipline, sought to unify the church that was becoming further and further spread out. And despite this desire for unity, the church was beginning to fragment once again. It had fragmented soon after the arrival in Germantown, and it was again starting to fragment now in the late 1860s. And this was due to a difference in belief, a difference of opinion, and also differences in the manner in which they practiced their faith. This was partly due to the distance at which members now found themselves and how far they lived apart from one another, and the limits of technology. We have to remember they didn't have email. They had to rely upon the horse or postal riders as they went from town or from village to village, from city to city, from place to place. It took a lot longer to get the mail than just simply opening up their phones. And they also realized that there were some necessities or some changes that were necessary to make. One of those changes was in how they washed one another's feet during Love Feast. There was a great division between the Far East Brethren and the Far West Brethren, those that lived west of the Mississippi and those that lived east of the Mississippi, and how it was that they should practice their foot washing. I also believe that changes were occurring as they assimilated themselves into the dominant culture. No longer did the membership of the church see themselves as immigrants, but began to see themselves for the first time as Americans. Even though they still spoke German, at least to a certain degree, they spoke English as well, and so began to become more of a part of the culture that surrounded them. This shift cannot be understated. And as we progress through the next few decades, we will see how this more fully develops and the conflicts that arise within the church and the result of those conflicts. With it also comes the church world tension, that is, when one is of the world or in the world, but not of the world. This is a tension that still exists within the Church of the Brethren. It is one of the talking points. If we listen closely to the issues which have been raised over the past 40 some years, we will know that this is still something that exists within our denomination, and we have not found a place in which we can compromise and come to agreement or agree to disagree. Again, I look forward to our conversation this Sunday morning at 9:30. If you have any questions, feel free to email or to call me, either at the church or on my cell phone. I look forward to the conversation that we have, and I appreciate you for engaging in that. Until Sunday, take care. Blessings.